It was a regular afternoon on the bus, with only a few passengers seated here and there. The old black woman, with short gray curls and wearing a modest white floral dress, sat quietly by the window. Her brown leather handbag rested gently on her lap, and her calm expression betrayed a deep sense of hurt as she stared out at the world passing by. She had seen her share of difficulties in life, but today's experience seemed different. Across from her, a white man stood in the aisle. He had short brown hair and was dressed in a red t-shirt and black jeans. His face was twisted with anger, his mouth wide open as he shouted, "You need to move," he yelled, his finger pointing directly at the elderly woman. The man's voice was loud and harsh, and the force behind it was impossible to ignore. His whole body leaned toward her aggressively, as if he thought his anger would push her out of the way. The other passengers on the bus shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not wanting to get involved, but not knowing how to ignore what was happening right in front of them. The elderly woman didn't flinch, though. She simply looked at him with quiet dignity. Her calmness was a sharp contrast to the man's fury, and she didn't respond with any anger of her own. Instead, she said softly, "I am not moving, son." Her voice was firm, but it carried no trace of the man's aggression. Her words only seemed to infuriate him more. He stepped closer, towering over her now, and shouted even louder, "You don't belong here. Go back where you came from." The words were cruel, and they echoed in the quiet bus. The elderly woman didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her expression still calm but clearly hurt by his words. At the front of the bus, the black bus driver had been watching the scene unfold in the rearview mirror. He had a very short black haircut and wore a white transit uniform with short sleeves, his name tag visible on his chest. His face was serious, his eyes never leaving the road, but there was an unmistakable sense of protectiveness in the way he watched the exchange. He had seen situations like this before, and today he was not going to let this one continue. With a calm but firm step, the bus driver stood up from his seat. The other passengers fell silent as they realized what was happening. The bus driver moved toward the aisle, his movements purposeful and controlled. He wasn't looking at the passengers anymore. His attention was focused entirely on the man who had been yelling. There was a sense of finality in the way he approached, as if he had already made up his mind about what was going to happen next. The bus driver's eyes locked with the angry man's, and he didn't hesitate. "You need to get off the bus," the driver said, his voice steady and unyielding. The man opened his mouth to argue, but the bus driver didn't give him the chance. He continued, "This is not how we treat people. You're getting off right now." The man's face turned red with embarrassment and anger, but the driver stood his ground. He wasn't going to let the bus ride continue in this way. The passengers watched in stunned silence as the situation began to shift. It was clear the driver wasn't just protecting the elderly woman. He was standing up for what was right, and that made all the difference. The man stared at the bus driver for a moment, his face reddening with anger. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially by someone he saw as beneath him. The driver stood tall, his expression serious and unwavering. He had already made it clear that this situation wouldn't go unchecked. "I'm not getting off," the man snapped, his voice thick with defiance. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he took a step forward, as if he was ready to argue further. But the driver didn't flinch. He just stared back with the same calm intensity. "You are," the bus driver said firmly. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. "You're causing a scene, and that's not something we're going to allow on this bus." The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking at the floor, some watching the scene unfold. The old woman, still sitting by the window, didn't speak. Her eyes were still cast down, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the growing tension between the driver and the angry man. The man took another step forward, his body tense with frustration. "You can't just throw me off," he yelled. "I paid for my ticket." He seemed to think that his payment gave him some kind of authority to treat others however he pleased. But the bus driver wasn't backing down. "You're disrupting the peace of this bus," the driver responded. "That's not how we treat people. You're leaving, or I'll call the police." The man's eyes widened for a moment as he realized the driver wasn't going to back off. His anger turned into frustration as he looked around the bus, seeing the passengers quietly observing. They were all looking at him, some with curiosity, others with silent judgment. He had no allies here. The man huffed, his face twisted with disbelief, and muttered angrily under his breath. He took a step back, still glaring at the driver. "Fine, I'll leave," he said, his voice low and grumbling, but there was no real conviction behind the words. He didn't want to lose this battle, but he could see that pushing any further would only make him look worse. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the front of the bus, his feet dragging heavily. The driver stepped aside to allow him to pass, but didn't look away. He watched as the man reached the doors, still muttering insults under his breath. The bus driver stood where he was, not moving an inch until the man was off the bus. As soon as the doors closed behind the angry passenger, the bus driver turned back toward the rest of the passengers. There was a brief silence, a stillness that seemed to settle in the air. The elderly woman, who had been watching quietly this whole time, let out a small sigh. It wasn't one of relief, but of acknowledgement. The man who had caused the disturbance was gone, but there was something deeper in the air now, a sense of justice, even in the smallest moments. The bus driver returned to his seat, his expression still serious, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he looked around the bus. His eyes met the eyes of the elderly woman, and he gave her a small nod. She gave him a nod in return, her calmness never wavering. The passengers around them seemed to exhale in unison, the tension now broken. The bus rolled forward again, the usual hum of the engine filling the silence. The bus moved forward, its wheels turning smoothly on the road, but the atmosphere inside remained tense for a while. The elderly woman, who had been at the center of the conflict, sat still by the window, her expression calm but pained. She had endured much in her life, but moments like these still stung. Despite the bus driver's intervention, the words of the man who had yelled at her lingered in her mind. She sat quietly, letting the thoughts settle as the hum of the engine filled the silence. The other passengers remained quiet, unsure of what to say or how to react. They had witnessed the uncomfortable exchange, and though the situation had been resolved, it had left a heavy weight in the air. Some people stared out of the window, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone, while others simply looked down at their hands or the floor. Everyone had their own way of processing what had just happened. At the front of the bus, the driver's expression remained focused as he steered the vehicle down the street. He wasn't a man who showed much emotion, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had done the right thing. He had always believed in standing up for what was fair, even in the smallest moments, and today had been no different. As the bus continued on its route, the passengers began to shift in their seats, starting to relax a little. The driver's firm stance had sent a clear message that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable, and in some ways, it gave them all a sense of reassurance. They didn't have to be afraid of standing up for what was right, even if they had been too afraid to speak up earlier. The elderly woman, still sitting near the window, gave a small, quiet sigh. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced disrespect in her life, but she also knew that some people, like the bus driver, were willing to do what was right when it mattered most. That small act of standing up for her had made all the difference, even if she didn't say much herself. The bus stopped at the next corner, and a few new passengers got on. The driver greeted them with a simple nod, and they took their seats without any trouble. The bus felt quieter now, as if the earlier tension had been erased. The ride continued smoothly, with no more disturbances. As the bus approached its final stop, the elderly woman stood up, her movements slow and steady. She gathered her brown leather handbag and walked toward the front of the bus. The driver noticed her and gave her a respectful nod. She nodded back, her expression still calm, but there was a small sense of gratitude in her eyes. The passengers who had been watching the whole event unfold glanced at each other, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. They had all witnessed something important, something that reminded them that standing up for others, even in small moments, could have a lasting impact. The bus came to a stop, and the elderly woman stepped off, walking with quiet dignity into the world outside. And as the bus continued on its way, the passengers, now a little more aware of what it meant to act with kindness and respect, carried that lesson with them. The bus continued its journey, and as it moved through the streets, the passengers sat in a thoughtful silence. The atmosphere felt different now. The previous tension that had hung in the air had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding that something important had happened. The elderly woman, who had been the center of the conflict, had left the bus, but her calm strength seemed to linger with the others. The bus driver, who had acted with such confidence and calm in standing up for the elderly woman, went back to focusing on the road. He glanced at the rearview mirror occasionally, keeping a steady watch over the bus and its passengers. His face was still serious, but there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing he had made the right choice. He had chosen to act, and in doing so, he had made the space safer for everyone. The passengers who remained on the bus shifted in their seats. Some were deep in thought, considering what had just happened. Others seemed to relax, letting the tension slowly dissolve. One by one, a few passengers began to return to their phones or books, their minds slowly letting go of the earlier disturbance. The bus was once again filled with the usual hum of daily life. But this time, there was something different about it, a kind of unspoken connection between the people inside, a shared awareness of the power of standing up for what is right. A man sitting in the middle of the bus, who had been quietly observing the whole exchange, glanced at the elderly woman's empty seat. He shook his head slightly, a mix of frustration and sadness crossing his face. He had felt powerless when the angry man had been yelling, unsure of what to do. But now he realized something. He didn't have to stay silent next time. He could be the one to speak up, just as the bus driver had. Another woman, sitting near the back, looked around at the other passengers. She hadn't said anything during the conflict, but now she found herself thinking about the bus driver's actions. She realized that it wasn't just about protecting one person. It was about protecting everyone. Standing up against cruelty, even in small moments, made a difference in the lives of others. She made a mental note that no matter where she was, she too would do her part to make sure people felt safe and respected. The bus reached the next stop, and a few more passengers got off. The bus driver stopped the bus, and they quickly walked to the door. No one said much as they exited, but there was a certain calmness in the air now. It wasn't just the passengers who had been affected by the events. The bus itself seemed quieter, more thoughtful, as if it too had learned something about how to handle the challenges of the world outside. The driver, still calm, focused on the road ahead, ready for whatever would come next. He had done something important today, but he knew that small acts of kindness and courage were just as important as any big gesture. It wasn't about fame or praise. It was about doing what needed to be done in the moment. As the bus made its way through the city, it was clear that the impact of this small but powerful act would stay with everyone for a long time. As the bus continued its route, the events from earlier still seemed to hang in the air, though no one spoke about them. The driver, still focused on the road, kept his eyes on the street ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but his mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the brief but powerful moment when he had stood up to the angry passenger. The other passengers seemed to be processing the situation in their own ways. A woman sitting near the front of the bus had been watching the entire scene, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked down at her hands, thinking. She had always believed that people should stick together, but today she saw how important it was to take action. The bus driver had done what she hadn't been able to do. He had spoken up, and in doing so, he had shown that it was possible to stand firm in the face of cruelty. She made a silent vow to herself that, next time, she wouldn't stay silent. A man seated across from her, who had been lost in thought, now looked up. He hadn't said anything during the confrontation, but his eyes followed the empty seat where the elderly woman had been. He remembered the anger in the man's voice and how the bus driver had stepped in. He couldn't help but think about how powerful the act of standing up for someone could be. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about showing that everyone deserved respect, no matter their age or appearance. He wondered if the world would be a better place if more people were willing to act when they saw something wrong. As the bus drove on, a few more stops came and went. Passengers got on and off, but the earlier tension had disappeared. There was a new, quiet understanding between them. No one spoke about what had happened, but it was clear that everyone was thinking about it. The bus driver, still in his seat at the front, seemed to be at peace with the choice he had made. He had simply done what he believed was right, and that was enough. It wasn't about expecting praise. It was about knowing that sometimes doing the right thing meant making a difficult decision, even when it was uncomfortable. At the back of the bus, a young man sat quietly, staring out the window. He had been one of the passengers who had watched the scene unfold, and now he found himself thinking about the old woman. She had sat there so calmly, despite the cruel words directed at her. The man felt a pang of guilt for not stepping in earlier, but he also felt a sense of pride in the driver's actions. It was clear that what mattered wasn't just what was said, but what was done. He promised himself that, in the future, he would be more aware of how he could help others in similar situations. The bus moved through the city, past familiar streets, as the passengers went back to their routines. The elderly woman was long gone, but her quiet strength had left an impression. The bus driver, still focused on the road, had done something simple but important. And in that moment, he had made a difference, not just in the life of one person, but in the way everyone on that bus would see the world around them. As the bus continued down the road, the normal buzz of daily life began to take over again. The sound of people talking, the occasional beep of a car horn, and the noise of the city outside filled the air. Yet there was still something different about the atmosphere inside the bus. The passengers were quiet, reflective. They had all witnessed something that wasn't easy to ignore, even if no one spoke about it. The driver had acted, and that action had resonated with everyone on board. One of the passengers, a man sitting in the middle of the bus, glanced around at the other faces. He had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, but now couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had seen the anger in the man who yelled, but more importantly, he had seen the calm strength in the elderly woman. He realized how much courage it took for her to remain composed, even in the face of such cruelty. And he admired the bus driver for stepping in, for doing what most people would only think about doing. It had made him wonder, how often do people stay quiet when they should speak up? How many times had he stayed silent when he could have done something? He looked down at his hands, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure why he hadn't acted during the confrontation, but now he knew that he couldn't stay silent in the future. It was small moments like this that built a better world, and it wasn't always easy to know when to take a stand. But today, he had seen it clearly. Standing up for what's right can change the way things unfold. A woman sitting in the front, near the doors, shifted in her seat and glanced toward the front of the bus. The driver was focused, his eyes straight ahead, but she could tell by the calm in his demeanor that he was still thinking about what had happened earlier. She wasn't sure if he realized how much his actions had affected everyone on board, but she knew. The driver had shown that sometimes standing up to someone in the wrong wasn't just about protecting others. It was about making sure the wrong behavior didn't go unnoticed. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how rare it was to see someone take action like that. People usually let things slide, either out of fear or indifference. But today, the driver had stood firm. And even though the moment had passed, the ripple effect was still there, a silent reminder to everyone who had witnessed it. As the bus made its way toward the final stop, the passengers began to gather their belongings. A few people stood up, ready to leave. The quiet reflection on the bus was interrupted by the sound of doors opening, and some of the passengers exchanged quiet nods with one another. They had all been part of something, whether they realized it or not. The bus stopped one final time, and the remaining passengers stood to exit. The elderly woman was long gone, but the effect of her quiet strength and the driver's intervention lingered. The young man who had been lost in thought earlier walked toward the door. He glanced once more at the bus driver, giving him a silent nod of respect. The driver returned the gesture, his face still calm, but now holding something more, an understanding that his actions had made a difference. As the man stepped off the bus, he felt a sense of clarity. The world wasn't always kind, but there were always people willing to stand up for what was right. Today had shown him that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't about making a big statement. It was about making sure people felt safe and respected. And in that, he found hope. As the last few passengers exited the bus, a sense of calm settled over the remaining riders. The bus driver continued his route, focused on the road ahead, but something about today had shifted. He hadn't expected to become the center of attention or to be praised for his actions. In fact, he hadn't done it for that reason at all. He had simply reacted to a situation that demanded attention. The bus was quieter now. The usual buzz of conversations and the occasional sound of people rummaging through their bags was absent. The few passengers left on the bus sat in quiet reflection, each thinking about the events that had unfolded earlier. They had all witnessed something that wasn't easy to ignore, and it made them think about how they might act in similar situations. A young woman sitting by the window, her gaze fixed on the passing streets, kept replaying the confrontation in her mind. She hadn't said a word during the exchange, but she knew that she would never forget how the bus driver had stepped in. His calmness and firm stance had been a reminder of what it meant to stand up against injustice. She had always believed that people should treat others with respect, but today she saw firsthand how sometimes doing the right thing took courage. She thought about how easy it could have been to stay silent. Everyone on the bus could have kept their heads down, ignored what was happening, and gone about their day. But the driver had chosen not to. He had stepped in, and in doing so, had made a difference. That simple act made her feel hopeful. It reminded her that there were still people willing to do what was right, no matter how small the act may seem. Near the back of the bus, a man who had been deep in thought earlier now looked up. He had seen how the bus driver had handled the situation with grace and authority. The man was no stranger to conflict, but he had always struggled with what to do in such situations. Today, though, he felt inspired. He realized that standing up for someone wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. Whether it was speaking out or simply offering support, everyone had a part to play. He felt that, moving forward, he would be more conscious of how he could contribute to making situations like that better. He didn't want to be someone who stood by when something wrong was happening. The bus continued down the road, each stop bringing new people on board. The usual flow of passengers had returned, but something had shifted. There was a new understanding among those who had witnessed the earlier exchange. They didn't need to talk about it, but the silent acknowledgement was there. They all knew what had happened, and they all knew that they had been part of something important. When the bus finally reached the last stop, the remaining passengers stood up to exit. The bus driver, still as focused as ever, gave them a small nod as they left. Each passenger, whether they had spoken or not, had been affected by what had transpired. And as the bus pulled away from the stop, it was clear that the ripple effect of that one moment would continue, even if no one said another word about it. The bus moved steadily through the streets as the day went on, but the earlier events still echoed in the minds of those who had been on board. The quiet reflections of the passengers showed that something had changed, even if they didn't fully understand it. The confrontation with the angry passenger and the calm response of the bus driver had left an impression that couldn't easily be shaken. As the bus continued on its route, new faces stepped onto the vehicle, unaware of what had happened earlier. The energy in the air was different, though. The usual sounds of the bus were the same. People talking on phones, the shuffling of bags, the occasional cough. But there was a subtle shift in how everyone carried themselves. It was as if the events of the day had made everyone a little more aware, a little more conscious of what it meant to stand up for each other. The driver, who had simply done what he believed was right, remained focused as he steered the bus through the busy streets. His face still showed little emotion, but the weight of his actions was clear. He hadn't acted out of anger or a desire for recognition. He had simply chosen to intervene when someone was being wronged. The elderly woman had been treated unfairly, and in that moment, the driver had chosen to step in. A man sitting in the middle of the bus glanced toward the front. He had been one of the passengers who had watched the scene unfold, and he still found himself thinking about the elderly woman. She had faced the anger of the racist passenger without responding with aggression or fear. Her calmness had been a quiet strength that contrasted with the shouting man. He felt that he had learned something important that day, that there was power in remaining calm, in refusing to let someone else's anger control you. He looked around at the other passengers and wondered if they, too, had been affected by what had happened. It wasn't just about what the bus driver had done. It was about the way everyone had witnessed the moment and how it had caused them to think. People didn't always have to speak up to make a difference. Sometimes, just witnessing an act of kindness or standing up for what's right was enough to make an impact. The woman near the front, who had been lost in thought for most of the ride, now glanced at the door as the bus slowed down. She had thought about the bus driver's actions and how they had changed the way she viewed the world around her. It wasn't always easy to speak up, and it wasn't always clear what the right thing to do was. But today had reminded her that standing up for someone, no matter how small the gesture, made a difference. As the bus reached its final stop, the remaining passengers stood to leave. The young man who had been sitting near the window glanced toward the driver, offering a silent nod of appreciation. The bus driver, still looking straight ahead, returned the nod. It was a simple moment, but one that carried a shared understanding between them. With that, the passengers stepped off the bus, each with their own thoughts. They had all been part of something, whether they realized it or not. The world outside was busy and chaotic, but for just a moment, they had witnessed something important. A reminder that standing up for what's right, no matter how small the act, mattered. The bus pulled away, and the passengers, now a little more aware of their power to make a difference, carried on with their day.